Good evening and a warm welcome to today's session on BIC Streams in collaboration with the Association of Designers of India. Chandigarh Chairs, Missing Histories, towards a critical design history of Chandigarh's modernist furniture. Joining us today are Petra Seitz, Nia Thandapani, and Gregor Wiitrick. Thank you, Nia, for helping us put this panel together, and thank you all for joining us. Before I hand over to Nia, you can sign up to our mailing list or follow us on our social media channels to get updates from us. We will be sharing the bios of today's panelists on the chat box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Next to the chat box is the Q&A box. Please type in your questions in there. With that, over to you, Nia.
Thank you, Raghu. And thank you all for joining us this evening, and to Bangalore International Centre for inviting us to speak about our work. And thank you also to the Association of Designers of India for their support of this talk as well. I'm just going to share my screen. So we're very happy to be here to talk a little about our work on Chandigarh's modernist furniture and some of the larger questions that the story of these pieces has raised for us as design historians. As is by now well known, these pieces of modernist design, and particularly the chairs, have exploded in international popularity and price over the past 15 years. Pieces of Chandigarh's furniture have fetched over $300,000 at auction, are held in the collections of at least 4 museums on 2 continents, and have been the cause for ongoing media and diplomatic contention. The furniture, especially the chairs, has been well covered in architecture, design, and interior design publications and lifestyle blogs, as well as on international mainstream media platforms like New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Martha Stewart Living. We originally titled this talk Chandigarh Chairs, Missing Histories. And whilst this might still be a fair title, the material we're presenting today has evolved a bit since we first conceived it. You might now say that instead, Chandigarh Chairs Unpacking a Constructed Narrative might be more accurate to the content you'll hear over the next 55 minutes or so. So far, much of what we've been up to has been building a historiography. And this evening, we'll be telling a story of Chandigarh's modernist furniture, but more so, we'll be telling the story of these particular objects, by which we mean the process through which these chairs has risen to fame, the people behind this process, and how we suggest this has warped our understanding of what these pieces are, what their history is, and what they represent. We'll be suggesting that a narrative around these chairs has been constructed, which has shifted the focus and understanding of this furniture from being Chandigarh chairs to being Jeanneret chairs, from being functional pieces of furniture to luxury design commodities, from being Indian to being European, and from being objects which were manufactured to being objects of high design. We'll also be arguing that through these shifts, the audience for whom the Chandigarh chairs are relevant has also changed, moving away from the people of Chandigarh, and in fact normal people all over the world, to a small group of elite consumers. We'll also talk about how, through this process, a number of problems have emerged in this narrative, and how many details and baseline facts about this furniture are still, at least publicly, a mystery, seemingly supported with anecdotal evidence. And we'll be arguing that this narrative is a form of extractive capitalism, shaped in order to increase the financial value of Chandigarh's modernist furniture and line the pockets of the art and antiques dealers and auction houses trading in them. We'll talk in some detail about our own work with a very large set of auction house data. We'll talk about how that large set of auction house data illuminates the way in which the story of Chandigarh's modernist furniture has been curated and manipulated, as well as how this data provides one set of evidence upon which to build a more accurate and a more just narrative of these furniture pieces. We're going to start today by giving a very brief introduction to both the history and the design of the furniture before elaborating how we're approaching our larger research project. We'll then dive into an explanation of what we're calling the constructed narrative. Following this, we'll highlight a few of the largest issues that this narrative raises for us, and outline a few ways we believe as a design community we can begin to shift how we think and talk about Chandigarh's furniture.
Following partition in 1947 and the annexation of Lahore to Pakistan, a new capital was needed for the Indian Punjab. Chandigarh was constructed to serve as the region's administrative centre, as well as to provide a symbolic new city for the new Indian government. It was to be, in Prime Minister Nehru's words, a new town, symbolic of the freedom of India, unfettered by traditions of the past, and an expression of the nation's faith in the future. The planning and architecture of Chandigarh has been written about at length by Sarbjit and Surinder Bhaga, Deepika Gandhi, and Rajesh Vatas, Dr. Kiran Joshi, Dr. S.S. Bhatti, and Vikramaditya Prakash, to name just a few. Many, but not all of these writers have centered their work around the involvement of Chandigarh's head architect and star of modern architecture, Le Corbusier. While the broad architectural Chandigarh narrative is by now quite well known, it's worth repeating briefly as their approach has been mirrored by a great deal of the writing on Chandigarh's furniture until now. The project's first team, American architect and planner Albert Mayer and Polish-American architect Matthew Nowicki, had already begun planning Chandigarh when Nowicki was killed in a plane crash. With Mayer unwilling to continue alone, the search for a new team to lead the project was initiated, ultimately resulting in the appointment of, among others, Le Corbusier and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret. While Le Corbusier redesigned the plan for the city and capital complex largely from his office in Paris, Jeanneret, along with British architects Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry, relocated to Chandigarh, becoming part of the large team of architects and planners who executed the wider design for the city. In addition to the capital complex, the team in Chandigarh designed everything from cinemas and private homes to daycare centres and hospitals, and, crucially for us, the furniture which would be placed within these buildings. This furniture ranges from leather upholstered seating for the High Court to the now ubiquitous wooden armchairs of the administrative buildings. Beds were made for the university accommodation, shelving, tables and chairs were created for the libraries, manhole covers for the streets, and ventilation shutters for the buildings. Jeanneret also personally experimented with pieces for his own use, made in lesser numbers, such as these bamboo and woven rope chairs. Examples of all these pieces I've just mentioned have at some point been removed from Chandigarh and resold on the international, predominantly European and American art market. The furniture made for Chandigarh generally conforms to a now recognizable style, and whether it's a chair, a table, or a stool, most pieces are geometric in form, made from angular, thick-cut and joined timber, often with woven cane or leather seats and backs. The furniture is visually streamlined, free from decorative elements, and economical in its use of materials. Made using a few individual timber sections and joined using standard woodworking techniques like these mortise and tenon and finger joints. Several designs for the legs replicate forms of supporting structures typically employed for their strength in the construction of modern architecture. These forms, such as the bridge and V shapes used for the legs in a number of pieces, give the furniture a structural quality and appearance. A number of pieces of Chandigarh's modernist furniture also appear to draw inspiration from earlier works, and here we concur with architectural historians Vikramaditya Prakash and Mary Stella Cassiato, who have noted the similarity between certain pieces of Chandigarh furniture, you can see on the right, and Pierre Jeanneret's earlier 1947 scissor chair on the left. There also is a clear adoption of the charpoy form for pieces which dealers and auction houses tend to refer to as daybeds, as well as, we believe, visual similarities between some of Chandigarh's chairs and plantation chairs. The solid hardwood from which most of the furniture is made is extremely hard-wearing and able to withstand heavy institutional use. The construction of the furniture using straight sections of timber and geometric forms for the frames and legs, along with the types of joints used to hold them together, would have been easy to repair if they did eventually wear out. Similarly, the cane of the seats and back could be removed and replaced when broken. And indeed, much of the furniture we have seen from images seems to have sustained heavy use, and many of the pieces show signs of modification and repair. And today you can see this hardy furniture on Instagram, and lots of it, in the homes of the rich and famous, and in interiors crafted by big-name designers such as Axel Verdwood. Furniture continues to come up at auction on a regular basis, including a sale at Rago Arts just 2 weeks ago. Reproductions or reissues of the design also continue to be produced today, made by companies like Phantom Hands in Bangalore. In contrast, the Vidhan Sabha chair, that shares many visual similarities with the quintessential Chandigarh chair, was produced alongside other designs at the Chandigarh Model Bural jail until recently. And you can get hundreds of apparently American-style chairs in bulk on Alibaba. Despite the presence of Chandigarh chairs in so many places, our first exposure to these designs came in a roundabout manner. In 2015, Nia bought a number of pieces of furniture from the new Government Electrical Factory, or NGF, sale in Bangalore. This was a large-scale sale of non-architectural content of the factory, which included everything from heavy industrial machinery to furniture and signage. A few years later, she showed the images of her furniture to Petra, who was doing research for the Victoria and Albert Museum's furniture department, where she'd come into contact with the Chandigarh chairs. Looking at these two sets of furniture side by side raised a number of questions, particularly about the visual similarities between Chandigarh furniture and the chairs from NGF. Were they connected in any way? And how did the NGF chairs fit into the narrative of Chandigarh, if at all? With no quick and easy answers in sight, the two of them asked me if I would like to work on the initial research, given my love of chairs and previous work on them. And our research began. Together, we're seeking to write a critical design history of Chandigarh's modernist furniture. And by this, we mean that we want to write about these objects of design in a more holistic and complete way, in a way which fulfills the design historical brief to interrogate design, production, and consumption, but also in a way which situates these objects of design within larger socio-political events and ideas. We're looking to explore and write about more than a series of fancy or expensive objects, or a select few designers and their impacts. Instead, we're hoping that our work on Chandigarh's furniture can explore a fuller history of its design, including how and what the furniture has been shaped by and what it has influenced. But our position as three Western researchers is limited, not least because none of us live in Chandigarh, but also because of what we do and do not have access to in terms of experience, knowledge, and material. To pursue ethical scholarship in this context, we felt it was necessary to lay out a clear methodology for ourselves. And while this isn't something we're going to go into detail about today, there are a few foundational points which we feel are key to our work. Namely, a willingness to grapple with the entire history of Chandigarh's furniture and to call out those who have benefited from the constructed narrative, movement, and resale of these objects, and to produce regenerative, open research which is accessible to fellow researchers now and in the future.
With these two particular points in mind, and with travel to Chandigarh put on hold because of coronavirus, we've had to rethink what research is currently both possible and meaningful for this project. And this has led us to take a deep dive into data produced by auction sales of Chandigarh's furniture. By looking at almost 1,500 lots, we've generated a massive data set of over 2,000 individual pieces of furniture sold at auction houses, including Christie's, Sotheby's, Wright, Art Curial, Rago, Saffron Art, and Auggette's. And since these auctions keep on coming, we've had to keep up to date with recent lots, and we've done so using a custom-built piece of software described to us as, and this is a long one, an open source cloud-based web crawler that uses advanced heuristics to pull near real-time auction data. Or in non-programmer language, the software looks through auction house websites and tells us pages we haven't seen yet. And all this information that we've collected is currently housed in a spreadsheet so large that it's just about hit the cell limit in Google Sheets. It contains most of the publicly listed information for each item put up for sale. The title the piece has been given, the name and date of the sale, any listed description of the piece, physical dimensions, photos, estimated price, sale price, a URL, and information that auction houses have categorized as prominence. And we believe that this data can shed light on how the furniture was designed, constructed, and repaired, in addition to providing solid evidence on how the current dominant narrative of Chandigarh's chairs has been constructed. This data has the potential to fill gaps in much of the writing on Chandigarh's furniture, providing decisive and easily accessible evidence to support claims, something which, as we'll explain, has sometimes been lacking up until this point. In our data set, each category of information has a unique role to play in uncovering a fuller story of the furniture. So listed dimensions can help shed light on the design and construction of the pieces. Bibliographical references show how provenance is created. Prices can help us map the popularity and financial value of the furniture. And of course, these uses just begin to scratch the surface. And we should add that in keeping with our desire for regenerative research, we're working with our tech consultants, also known as my husband and his close friend, to make this data set both publicly available and easily usable. So if you're interested in seeing or experimenting with this once it's online, please do let us know and we'll try to keep you in the loop.
We believe that the current predominant narrative of Chandigarh's modernist furniture was, as our terminology suggests, constructed. This narrative is by now well known around the world. It positions Pierre Jeanneret as the sole creator of Chandigarh's furniture and claims that 40 years after its creation, the furniture was not being duly appreciated by Chandigarh's residents. As we mentioned earlier, this narrative shifts the focus on these objects from being Chandigarh chairs to being Jeanneret chairs, from being functional pieces of furniture to being luxury design commodities, from being objects that were manufactured to being objects of high design, and from being Indian to being European. We believe that these shifts have allowed the furniture to be popularized in the West by imbuing them with characteristics the market deems more valuable, therefore ensuring the furniture will sell for a higher price. We believe that this Jeanneret-focused narrative was in part constructed by the dealers responsible for the early sales of Chandigarh furniture, and that this narrative has been bolstered and cemented in place by the actions of auction houses and mainstream journalistic publications all over the world. And above all, we believe that this narrative may be less than accurate, that it selectively uses historical material to craft a story that increases the financial value of the furniture, and that the story was built to serve the art and antiques market and the wealthy people who are involved in this trade. While at times the process of creating and legitimizing the constructed narrative might sound like a conspiracy theory, it's actually well grounded in some hefty scholarly work. And here we're particularly interested in and inspired by the business scholar Dr. Per Hansen's work on the creation of a market for Danish modern furniture.
Our timeline of this narrative currently begins roughly in 1999, when a cadre of French antique dealers, including Eric Tuchelum and Gerald Moreau, took what they've called a prospecting trip to Chandigarh. This would be their first of over 30 trips to the city in the following 11 years, undertaken to, in their words, save from destruction Chandigarh's modernist furniture, which was, according to them, rotting away in indifference. During these 11 years, the dealers purchased an unspecified amount of the city's furniture, moved this furniture to France, had the pieces professionally refurbished, exhibited them, began writing a book on the furniture, and finally put the pieces up for auction. The first sale entirely dedicated to Chandigarh furniture was held in 2006 at the French auction house Art Curial and included 42 pieces, which were bought for prices ranging from $5,500 for a single stool to $121,000 for a university library table. And we want to start here by clarifying that Tuchelum and Moreau are antiques dealers with a history of buying relatively cheap modern furniture, building hype around it, creating interest in the pieces, in their designer, in their design, and most importantly, creating a market for their sale. Tuchelum himself had long been in the business of selling antique modern furniture through his gallery, Gallery 54, and had already completed a successful venture buying so-called forgotten furniture by the French designers Jean Prouvé and Charlotte Perriand in bulk from the Cité Internationale Université de Paris and reselling this for astronomical sums. Before the start of the initial sale solely dedicated to Chandigarh's furniture, the pieces were exhibited by Patrick Séguin, a one-time collaborator and business partner of Tuchelum. These exhibitions included a 2006 show in New York and a booth at the Biennale des Antiquaires, an international antiques exhibition in Paris in September of the same year. It's through these exhibitions that Jeanneret was introduced to the wider public as a genius furniture designer in and of his own right. His name took center billing in promotional material ahead of any mentions of Chandigarh or India. And through these exhibitions, the chairs were separated, both physically, of course, but also in terms of time, from their original home in Chandigarh, with archival images used to situate them in the distant past. Through their exhibition in sterile spaces, where sitting in them was presumably not encouraged, the Chandigarh chairs were positioned as high design commodities. Through these arrangements, the value of Chandigarh's furniture became disconnected from its roots and its use, and became tied instead to Jeanneret, the West, and the chair's ability to look pretty in fancy interiors. Beyond changes in narrative, these exhibitions also allowed for additional information to be added to the prominence section of any subsequent listings. Instead of just being pieces of furniture which two men claimed to have originated from Chandigarh, these items now had a past legitimized by one of the most important galleries for modernist furniture. These pre-sale promotions and exhibitions were thus crucial to cementing the narrative and subsequent success of Chandigarh's modernist furniture, establishing the importance of the objects and their provenance in a way that would be valued by the art market. And this sounds a little slimy on its own, two Frenchmen educating the world decisively about Indian design, but it becomes even more unsettling when we add in an understanding that the people and organizations profiting from this constructed narrative are the exact same people who seem to be constructing it in the first place. To us, this means, in short, that it's very likely that the narrative of Chandigarh's furniture that most people around the world know has been constructed not around the furniture's specific history or the merits of its design, but instead around making the furniture worth more money. The Jeanneret-focused narrative started by these initial exhibitions was then solidified by subsequent sales. Chandigarh furniture has been included in roughly 2 auctions a year by each of the major auction houses. These auction listings have repeated the information initially set forward in early exhibitions, that their designer is Jeanneret, that they're European in design, and that they are financially valuable high design commodities. Such understandings about Chandigarh's modernist furniture are further articulated and supported by auction houses through a reliance on Tushlam and Moreau's enormous and enormously expensive 2010 book, The Indian Adventure. The Indian Adventure is a hefty book clocking in at just about 600 heavyweight pages filled with mostly uncredited images of Chandigarh, its modernist furniture, and text justifying the extraction and resale of these items. This book originally cost around $150, but the initial print run seems to have been rather small, so the book can now only be found in a select few libraries or on sale for over $600. And I would add there that as of yesterday morning, it was selling on Amazon for over £1,200. And we've only been able to access the book through the British Library and the National Art Library at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which itself struggled to find a copy that it could afford. So in short, this book, which is used as really important proof for these listings, remains highly inaccessible to anyone interested in cross-checking the veracity of auction records. And in fact, auction houses started to use this book to illustrate the provenance of Chandigarh's furniture even before it was actually published, stating that pieces would be featured in the upcoming volume.
Beyond referring to Tushlam and Moreau's book to prove or improve the credibility of pieces of Chandigarh furniture being sold, auction houses also frequently use a furniture coding system developed in the Indian Adventure to identify Chandigarh's furniture. The last 50 or so pages of the book are dedicated to an inventory of the furniture compiled by the dealers, which has also now been updated, altered, and digitized, and is available on Gallery 54's website should anybody wish to have a look. The inventory suggests that it's an exhaustive list of Chandigarh's modern furniture and categorizes each piece by type, each of which is subdivided by style and assigned an alphanumeric code. Notably, while the bulk of the codes begin with the letters P.J. for Pierre Jeanneret, and some start with L.C. for Le Corbusier, no other architects or designers are credited in the coding system, and we'll come back to this in more detail shortly. These codes are now in widespread use, especially among auction houses and dealers, as they differentiate pieces and provide information on the designer, the type of furniture, and the particular design. But it should be noted that there's no information or explanation provided in the Indian Adventure as to what evidence has been used to create or assign these codes. This seems rather problematic to us because the creation and use of the inventory to classify furniture by the dealers, galleries, auction houses, and now us, continues to propagate a Jeanneret-centric narrative of the furniture. It turns the assertions of Tuchelum and Moreau into the working standard, an accepted shorthand for multiple important pieces of information. And the more widespread the use of this coding system becomes, the more difficult it becomes to challenge their narrative and extend attributions beyond Jeanneret and Le Corbusier. In addition, a selective use of images both in the Indian Adventure and on Gallery 54's website provide visual support to the constructed narrative. These images fit broadly into three categories. Firstly, images of Jeanneret and Le Corbusier, often seen working or sitting on the furniture, occasionally with other architects and designers. Secondly, images of broken furniture, including some with the dealers posing problematically with unnamed Chandigarh residents. And finally, gallery shots of the restored furniture on plinths or against white backdrops, where the furniture is displayed as if it were art. These three types of image help emphasize three key parts of the dealer's narratives. Firstly, that the furniture was designed by Pierre Jeanneret, who was associated with Le Corbusier. Second, that when the dealers found the furniture, it was abandoned, disused, and undervalued. And third, that they have saved the furniture and given it the attention it deserves as high design within a gallery setting. And while parts of this narrative may well be true, it does seem far from complete. And we'd like to stress here that while the Indian Adventure does contain a short bibliography, which does include material written by Chandigarh architect Jumila Uli Chowdhury and Pierre Jeanneret, there are almost no citations within the text that ties specific claims to published or verifiable primary information. Additionally, while the authors claim to have visited archives to back up their findings, they rarely provide information about the documents they accessed and in which archives they were found, both of which are the expected standard in any form of academic publishing. This is really important because, as we've already mentioned, the Indian Adventure has in many ways become the foundation on which both the market and the popular conceptualization and understanding of Chandigarh's furniture has been formed in the public eye. The growing interest in the Chandigarh furniture due to the high prices achieved at auction has encouraged further writing on the topic, which has led in turn to the publication of other large, expensive and inaccessible books, which place Pierre Jeanneret at the center of the narrative, as you can see from the titles alone. In addition to the large books, a great number of design, architecture and mainstream publications popularized the interest in Chandigarh's furniture, disseminating the idea of Jeanneret as the sole creator of the furniture. And at the same time, new furniture was removed from Chandigarh, has entered the market through dealers, galleries and auction houses, relying on the sale of earlier furniture and the growing number of publications to legitimize their sale. And in that way, the cycle continues.
The narrative of Chandigarh's modernist furniture constructed by the art and antiques market is important to highlight because it creates problems with significant social and political ramifications in what we believe are three key areas. First, authorship in terms of design and production, use, and impact. And we're going to start today with authorship in terms of design. This is perhaps the most obvious and egregious of issues raised by the constructed narrative of Chandigarh's furniture, and is also an issue which our data collection project highlights pretty well. And when we talk about the problem of authorship in terms of design, we're referring to the assertion of Jeanneret as the exclusive designer of Chandigarh's modernist furniture, and the accompanying erasure of the existence of the Indian team of architects. This is an assertion which is frequently presented as fact in many Western writings on Chandigarh chairs, including all of the articles we mentioned at the beginning of this talk and almost all auction records. And while we've identified this as a notable issue, we're certainly not the first to bring this up. The Architecture and Urbanism Forum, Chandigarh Urban Lab, created their own inventory of the Chandigarh furniture in 2009. The head of the project, Vikramaditya Prakash, later noted that while doing so, they realized that not all the pieces were designed by Jeanneret, and that their association with European modernists was crucial for their provenance. And he noted that A.R. Pavakar, Urmila Yuli Chowdhury, B.P. Mathur, and Aditya Prakash, Vikramaditya's father, were all involved in designing a lot of the furniture that was made in the city at the time. Separately, in an interview with Avery Trufelman, Prakash retold his father's story of the team of architects designing the furniture together over scotch in the evenings while working on the project. And a striking example of the almost complete erasure of Indian design influence on Chandigarh's furniture revolves around a lamp, a chair, and a grainy black and white image. While the inventory published in The Indian Adventure mentions in small print that Urmila Chowdhury and Jeet Malhotra quote unquote elaborated, respectively, a library chair and a lamp with Jeanneret, the actual coding for these objects omits this information. Assigned the codes PJSI51A and PJLU04A, as you'll see on the screen, with PJ standing for Pierre Jeanneret, these codes don't make any indication of Chowdhury or Malhotra's involvement. Such a robust attribution of the library chair and lamp to Jeanneret was pretty surprising to us, as we had seen the exact same image of the lamp in a 1961 Marg magazine article written by Urmila Chowdhury herself, Chandigarh team member and ultimately chief state architect of the state of Punjab. In the article, Chowdhury clearly and unambiguously attributes the respective design of the lamp to Malhotra and the library chair to herself. And because no mention is made to the existence of Chowdhury or Malhotra in the Indian Adventures object codes, very few mentions are made to either of these designers in auction listings. Only 2 of the 52 records we've collected of library chairs being sold provide any credit to Chowdhury. And while auction houses provide references to the inventory pages where the small text acknowledgement of Chowdhury and Malhotra could be discovered, again, the incredibly high price and rarity of Indian Adventure makes this information difficult, if not impossible, to find and check. And solely attributing the library chair and lamp to Jeanneret through inventory coding doesn't seem to be just a one-off error, as the updated and digitized inventory on the Gallery 54 website also contains a small reference to Chowdhury and Malhotra, but still retains both PJ codes. And such continued insistence of the exclusivity of Jeanneret's authorship is epitomized by Tuchelom and Patrick Seguin in their Instagram accounts, where the library chairs are meticulously tagged with Jeanneret's name, as well as a slew of other mostly unrelated Western mid-century designers, but not Malhotra or Chowdhury or any other member of the Indian team. So clearly here, there's a continuing push to associate these chairs not with the city of Chandigarh or Indian design legacies, but instead with the legacy and financial value of the European modernist tradition. And while the conundrum around the Marg issue is particularly bold, most instances of the erasure of the large team of Indian architects surrounding or working alongside Jeanneret are more banal. The bulk of auction listings and popular design press articles simply don't mention the existence of any other designers and mention little of the Indian context in which the chairs were designed. And again, since these publications rely heavily on Indian Adventure to support their assertions, sole authorship of the Chandigarh chairs is further ingrained into a closed loop, assuring that readers infrequently, if ever, see any mentions of Chowdhury or Malhotra or any of their fellow team members. And in addition to the erasure of individuals or teams within the auction records, our data suggests the whitewashing of the nationality of these pieces, and through this, the ongoing process of Europeanizing them. Both between and within auction houses, there doesn't seem to be any consensus on the national identity of the Chandigarh chairs. Sometimes the furniture is ascribed terms suggesting it's Swiss to match Jeanneret's original nationality, sometimes French/Indian, indicating Jeanneret's adopted nationality. But we've not yet come across a listing where the same sort of information suggests the objects are solely Indian. Even the charpoys from the student hostels are, according to this area of auction records, French/Indian. The erasure of the Indian designers and India itself as fundamental elements of Chandigarh's furniture perpetuates the placement of India and Indian designers on the periphery of the big history of modern design, seemingly implying that at its core, modernist design is a Western venture. And this in turn is hard to see as anything other than a continuation of colonial inequalities and a world stage and system set up to benefit the West in perpetuity. And as a aside here, here again, we've been inspired and led by the work of Vikramaditya, and we'd encourage anyone not familiar with his work to read Third World Modernism or Just Modernism, as well as his work with Amy Siegel for the magazine Bauhaus Now. And just to end this section, we absolutely recognize that authorship is an incredibly tricky topic to probe, and have had among ourselves a number of conversations working through how to approach it in terms of Chandigarh's furniture. So for example, while we all agree very strongly that it's neither accurate nor acceptable to erase the contributions that Yuli Chowdhury may have made to the design of the library chair, how do we weigh Chowdhury's individual input against team collaboration, against the power structure within which she and the team worked? And while many of these questions remain unanswered for us right now, we're nevertheless committed to ensuring that any claims we make in the future regarding authorship are based upon solid, well-cited, and publicly available information. But we'll get to that more at the end of the talk.
And with even the highly educated and well-respected Indian architects left out from the history of Chandigarh furniture, it comes as no surprise that the stories and the impacts of the craftsmen and labourers responsible for actually making the chairs have also been virtually eliminated from the narrative. The role of the craftsmen and labourers in making Chandigarh's modernist furniture have been so minimized in Western accounts that it wasn't until some 6 months of working on this project that we were alerted to the presence of metal tags on some pieces identifying their workshop of origin. While we had read suggestions in auction catalogues and articles that Chandigarh chairs were made by hand in a network of workshops, we had still not seen any proof of these claims until that point. So in 6 months of research, after looking through thousands of auction records, we had found a grand total of 0 mentions of these tags, tags which were both obvious and obviously important to parties in India working on Chandigarh furniture. The tags we have seen identify some production as happening in Delhi, and we've been told others also indicate production in Patiala and Ambala, and point to the mass scale on which this furniture was made, extending the narrative beyond Chandigarh alone. While the idea that this furniture stems solely from Chandigarh is something the art market has embraced, the idea that this furniture could be produced at least as far away as Delhi expands this narrative towards a wider Indian story. As we noted earlier, the dealers have used a detailed coding system in their inventory, giving extremely similar designs different model numbers. Take, for example, model numbers PJ, SI, 25, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. In the inventory, each of these designs are directly credited to Jeanneret, which introduces the idea that they are all separate designs conceived by the designer. This suggested intentionality removes any agency that the craftspeople making the furniture may have had in the slight variations between these pieces, further erasing their contribution to the furniture's creation. What an analysis of the auction record data actually makes clear is that there wide variations exist not only between supposedly different models, but also within the same model. With their meticulous documentation of furniture dimensions, the auction records demonstrate that there are tremendous discrepancies in the dimension of supposedly identical pieces. And despite Tushalom and Moreau's assertions of dimensions for each piece in the Indian adventure, our data indicates that there does not seem to be one standard size for many pieces. The data suggests that Tushalom and Moreau's coding system does not function well to describe the incredible diversity of Chandigarh's furniture, but does function very well to reinforce their narrative of the intentionality of Jeanneret as the designer, and further erases the contribution that different workshops and craftspeople may have had. Now, we want to suggest here that it's not only unacceptable, but in many ways very damaging that the manufacture of these chairs has been virtually eliminated from their popular narrative in Europe and America. After all, the making of these chairs has, quite literally, made them into what they are today. The condensed narrative of Chandigarh's furniture, which omits the history of the manufacture, not only continues the elimination of Indian people from the production of these pieces of furniture, making them appear more European, but also moves them further into an elite sphere, eliminating the presence of working class hands and minds from their design.
Beyond questions regarding the authorship of Chandigarh chairs, we've also struggled to find documentation on the use of this furniture between their initial design and their 21st century movement into the homes of the rich and famous. Many writers and commentators, including ourselves, are interested in looking at the workings and process of the initial design team and their intentions. Others, also including us, are interested in exploring the journey of the chairs after falling into Tushla Moreau's hands. But the period of the chairs' lives in Chandigarh itself seems not to have been integrated into either of the previous conversations. This chronological gap in knowledge and the related lack of acknowledgement of the furniture as functional items represents a sizable issue, because at least some of the furniture has continued to be used in Chandigarh by roughly the same original intended users ever since their production. Such lack of conversation regarding use signals what information is and is not valuable for the construction of the chairs as luxury items. Whilst they're supposed design by a white Western man connected to one of the biggest names in art, design, and architecture is thoroughly covered and explored, their use by Indians, including even prominent politicians and lawmakers, is diminished and underexplored. And here we can see really clearly that the information, stories, and experiences needed to build a rich history of the chairs is at some points in direct opposition with attempts to commodify the furniture. The chair's existence as functional Indian objects must be ignored by the dealers and design magazines and auction houses seeking to cash in on this furniture as European in order to build financial value around it. The temporal and experiential gap in writings on Chandigarh's furniture highlights that design and architectural histories frequently present an unbalanced understanding of whose experience and value of modernist design matters. If, as the art and antiques market has suggested, the primary way in which Chandigarh's furniture can be valued is for the so-called originals to accumulate financial value and to be situated as art objects in the homes of the rich, then it would have been difficult for them to have been so-called valued in Chandigarh itself. However, we would argue that such ideas about value and appreciation of this furniture have in many ways been created and propagated by the same groups of people who profit from buying and selling this original furniture. And that beyond notions of showing appreciation for furniture by treating it as a priceless object, there are, of course, many different ways to show appreciation for furniture and many different types of value that it can have beyond the financial. We believe that the simple fact that Chandigarh's modernist furniture was used for over 40 years and that during this time it was maintained and repaired and altered to make it more functional signals a tremendous amount of appreciation for the furniture. And further, it signals that the chairs were not only being appreciated, but appreciated in the way their designers intended, as functional furniture objects destined for firewood and scrap heap when they reached the end of their life. We suggest that if the furniture was understood to be valued and appreciated in Chandigarh, much of the justification for its removal by Tushla Moreau is negated, and the whole project of buying low, restoring, promoting, and selling high is called further into question. Additional unpublished exploration of the use of Chandigarh's furniture in Chandigarh then is the crucial missing piece of the story of this furniture, returning focus and information on the normal life of these chairs and recentering their history on India and on Indian design and architecture and people. Knowledge of the furniture's use in the city certainly exists, and we believe it is important that it's gathered, published, and shared publicly in order to address the current gaps in the narrative. With little written on Chandigarh's furniture as it existed and been used within India, it's then not surprising that little has also been written about the relationships between this furniture and the evolution of modern design in India. And this takes us back to where our project began and my own purchase of furniture from NGF in Bangalore. Both clearly and unsurprisingly, the Chandigarh chair's design circulated with India far before its so-called discovery by Western art dealers. This circulation has likely influenced or at least been seen by many people across the country, and yet this aspect of Chandigarh's furniture has remained relatively untouched by scholars. And we're especially interested in how specific Chandigarh chair designs circulated within India. We know very little about this right now, but there exists intriguing images of IIT Delhi designed by Chandigarh consulting architect J.K. Chowdhury, which feature several of the Chandigarh easy chairs and library chairs. These images raise a lot of questions. Are these chairs Chandigarh chairs? Were they made in Chandigarh and then brought to Delhi for use at IIT? Or were they built specifically for IIT? What was the motivation to bring these particular designs to Delhi? And how, if at all, is the migration of the Chandigarh chair design related to something like the NGF furniture? We believe the stories and career trajectories of the many Indian designers who worked on the Chandigarh project need to be integrated into the publicly available history of Chandigarh's furniture, making it evident that the story of these pieces doesn't end with the objects. And furthermore, how might this Chandigarh narrative relate and diverge from other modernist design histories in India, such as Nakashima at NID, or John Beazle and Fab India, or even earlier designs like the Godrej S chairs, or with the designs of Mini Boga and Ritam Mazumdar, about whom Ushmita Sahu spoke at BIC some weeks ago. This is the sort of history that is expected from other popular pieces of modernist furniture, but still remains largely absent from the narrative of the Chandigarh pieces as they have been defined by the art market. Narratives of the influence of Chandigarh's chair design within India and vice versa are crucially important because they can counterbalance histories that center around figures like Le Corbusier, which serve to continue to position modernist design as, at its core, a European venture. There is clearly a rich and substantial history of the chairs solely within India and related to India that needs to be further explored and given the attention and respect and a platform that it deserves, and we believe used to challenge the existing paradigm. As we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, highlighting the transformation of Chandigarh's government furniture into luxury commodities is only one part of what our project hopes to do and what we think must be done in order to treat the chairs and their creators and users with the respect and dignity they deserve. Without intervention, Tushaloom and Moreau and other dealers and auction houses will continue to do what they have done with Chandigarh's furniture. Take it, make it into something quote unquote valuable in the eyes of the market, erase its rich history and replace it with one that champions wealthy, privileged Western men. They will move on to other pieces of furniture in other countries, undertaking the same process and repeating the same neo-colonial actions, much like what Tushaloom has already done with his highly questionable removal of Jean Purier's Maison Tropicale from the Republic of the Congo. On these lines, the other component of our project is doing our part to help change the paradigmatic narrative of the chairs, to counter the untruths and unspoken elements through deeper primary research on the three main gaps we've outlined: authorship, use, and impact. Our data begins to scratch the surface and point out gaps, but there's also a need for both further solid primary research in Chandigarh and also making available, open, and accessible already existing research. As we've mentioned, the narrative of Chandigarh's furniture created by dealers, auction houses, the popular design press, and rich furniture buyers is propped up in a large part by lack of publicly available research. It is able to continue and spread because despite what appears to be speculation, it sounds like it could be true. And this only remains possible when information to the contrary isn't out there and available to the same people who are consuming the popular narrative. The suggestion that Uli Chowdhury played a role in the design of the library chairs and the discrepancies, apologies. So if information does come to light, information like the presence of the metal tags on the furniture, the suggestion that Uli Chowdhury played a role in the design of the library chairs, and the discrepancies in Tushaloom and Moreau's inventory, then the narrative built on presumptions and assumptions begins to become harder to assert and believe. And this is perhaps hard for us as academics and researchers to admit, but there's no amount of specialized knowledge held in the hands and minds of a few people that can really help change things on a broad scale. And it's only when the wider public sees and understands this information that we can begin to shift narratives and through them the real world consequences they create. As we mentioned earlier, we're in the process of making our auction data available and easily usable online, and would love to expand this to be a larger resource for those of us exploring and researching Chandigarh and modernist furniture within related to India. And on this note, we would love to talk to and work with anyone in the audience tonight or anyone that you might know about this project. So thank you very much for joining us, and please let us know if you have any questions or information that you'd like to share. And I'll hand over to Petra and Gregor, who I think have started to have a look through the questions.
We have, in fact, started to look through the questions. And I think we had a couple of questions, both related to the legalities of things revolving around Chandigarh's furniture. So both in removing it from India now, if it's proven to be quote unquote authentic, and also in producing new iterations of the design. So I was wondering, Gregor, if you wanted to start taking a stab at that one.
So the original designs more, sorry, do you want to have a go? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think that we've been talking a lot about phrasing this project in terms of morality and not legality, because we're seeing a lot of things happen that, while they might not be technically illegal, we don't think are right, and we think are connected with larger systems that are perpetuating inequalities. So we've sort of, in many ways, not devoted as much attention to the legality of what things are, because we think it doesn't necessarily reflect what it should be.
And I think on the note, there are a couple of questions here about the right to copy the furniture. And while we don't think we have any sort of conclusive proof of this, we have heard anecdotally that the furniture wasn't under copyright to begin with, and therefore is okay to copy. However, don't quote me on that.
I think also what this question raises about the furniture and is it right for anyone to copy them, I think it kind of ties in nicely to something that we feel quite strongly about, and which we kind of touched on at the end of the conversation, which is around the sort of original, so-called original design and not original design or copies, and the idea that the original designs have a certain value and copies don't. And actually, I think what we're trying to argue really is that if it's the design that is valuable, then whether it's original or not actually doesn't matter at all. It's the design itself that is being appreciated. And in that way, I think reproductions and reissues, if you want to call them copies, are a way of kind of appreciating the design, potentially in a more, I suppose in a different, maybe a more, what's the word I'm looking for? A more honest way than pinning down the originals as being the valuable commodity.
And then another question is asking about if we can expand a little bit on the design history brief and sort of how design history fits into the work that we're doing.
So I'm happy to take that one. I think what we didn't really touch on it for very long, but what we kind of mean there about this design history brief is kind of very specifically talking to the idea of design history as a discipline. And design history as a discipline is a fairly young discipline, but what it does generally lay out is this kind of triad of design, production, and consumption being at the sort of root of any design history. And I think we sort of agree with that those kind of broad areas, but would add, as many people do, the importance of context as well, and of context of all three of these things. So I think for us and the backgrounds that we come from, which are very much from a design history sort of background and education, I think that's kind of what we're interested in this furniture, is how you can apply those kind of three lenses plus this larger lens of context to the Chandigarh chairs and to the kind of narrative that's been created.
And sort of on the same vein of information and larger understandings, we have a question about what material we're looking to find in Chandigarh when we eventually get there, coronavirus restrictions pending.
Yeah, I think I'll take this one. I think because of the type of furniture that it is, this very sort of widespread, everyday use furniture, we think that there are a lot of oral histories to be sort of very meticulously recorded that could work very well as primary material. And it would have to be done in a sort of very meticulous way so that it could stand up to the current narrative, which is being sort of pushed. Because we're really interested in the use of the chairs and not just their design and their sort of resale much later in their life. The information on this type of sort of area, it would be really diffuse and would have to come from a lot of different sources. So, for example, students who might have gone through Chandigarh University, or any office workers who may have worked for years in the administrative buildings may or may not have snapshots which included the furniture in their own personal archives, but this material can be really difficult to find. And I think this is part of the reason we want to work with more people around India and Chandigarh who might have access to this type of information and be able to provide sort of more sources and material in that respect.
So there's a question from Sarita. Hi, Sarita. And maybe I'll read it, and then there's a couple of points in the question which I think are kind of interesting, so we could touch on those. So Sarita says, my present project is on seating in India along with Godrej archives and looking at a long trajectory from early medieval times and earlier to present day, with one section on modernism in India looking at NID, Godrej and Chandigarh. And I'm curious about two things. What was the point at which the chairs ended up on as scrap? And secondly, a comment on Pierre Jeanneret's personality from being in the shadow of Corbusier to coming into the limelight, not because of reasons that you have spoke of, and also a question about the CCA archives. So in terms of the CCA archives, actually they're quite, I mean, I think there might be other people in the audience tonight that can speak a bit better to this, but like they're well documented of what we've seen, but we're still not entirely sure what's online, how representative that is of the whole archive. But there is a lot of really well digitized photographs, some drawings that are up on their website, and you know, since we've not really been able to travel much, that's kind of been a great resource for us. Petra and Gregor, would you like to speak to the question about Jeanneret and Corbusier, and I can speak to the question about the chairs piling up?
Sure. So I think something that we're very aware of and has become more and more apparent the more work we do and the more we delve into auction listings in this process of building value is how tied up Jeanneret is to that, how tied he is to Corbusier. And so, for example, 40 years ago, many of the chairs that we now know to be designed jointly by Corbusier, Charlotte Perriand, and Pierre Jeanneret were only attributed to Corbusier. And we're starting to get a sense that over similar processes to the one we've described for Jeanneret in this talk, Charlotte Perriand was added to the narrative as more of her furniture became available and became put on the market. And then this was, again, the circle was sort of expanded to Jeanneret with the movement of Chandigarh's furniture onto the market. So I've absolutely forgotten the original question, but we're sort of seeing this ever expanding circle of elite Western modern designers. They're connected to Corbusier to give them prestige, but they have to have their own stories developed, and they have to become personalities with their own style and their own right in order to be sold for the same prices. And actually right now what we're seeing is that these pieces are being sold for even more than the Corbusier pieces, which is to us really, really shows how successful this sort of system of building value is.
And in terms of the furniture piling up, I think we don't know when the furniture started piling up. We've heard anecdotally somebody we know that has seen some of the furniture in the 80s, but it's unclear. I mean, what is clear is that there is photographs of the furniture which looks like maybe they could be taken in the 90s, where certain pieces are still in use. And depending on what your thoughts are in terms of originals versus kind of later reproductions, you know, it's still unclear essentially as to how long the furniture was used for, when it started to pile up. But I think one point that I would kind of add to just bringing up this idea of sort of furniture piling up is that it's been interpreted by the dealers and sort of, I would say, sort of narrated as a sign of the underappreciation of furniture. And I guess the question that I would like to ask is that why is the storage of large amounts of furniture which are now broken or which aren't fit for use, why is that a sign of underappreciation and not just storage while you figure out what to do with a massive amount of furniture? And I think this is, to me, it's sort of about how you interpret and then kind of narrate this narrative. And I think there was a question from Nora, who asks about our thoughts on the ethical museum practices for showcasing functional design items while resisting complicity in transitioning them into inaccessible luxury commodities for the benefit of private sellers, which I think is a great question.
I think I can start us off. I think we all have slightly different ideas of what should happen and what the involvement of museums in this cycle is. But something we're certainly grappling with is that in addition to the published books, the presence of these pieces in museums gives further value to them. So I could say that I'm personally not sure how we put these into the collections of big museums without increasing their financial value and making it harder for people to have access to them that aren't super wealthy. So it's a really hard question is my short answer, but I'll turn it over to Gregor and Nia too.
Yeah, I think it is a very hard question, but on the other hand, museums can be part of the widening of the sort of new narrative as it comes forward. And as in this particular case, for example, if people were able to more successfully and more sort of definitively attribute designs to a broader team rather than just Pierre Jeanneret, museums would play a key part in sort of dispersing that knowledge through their documentation of their collections. So there's that side to it as well.
I mean, I think what I would add is just that, as is probably clear from our talk, I think we're interested in this much longer history than the sort of originals which museums have tried to collect, or presumably have been trying to collect. And that actually, I think, the interesting story extends beyond those original objects into the furniture that continue to be made and into the furniture that continues to be made now. And I think it would be, you know, if museums are genuinely interested in exploring the real story of this furniture, I would like to see them collecting some of the newer pieces of furniture where we know who's produced them, we know the craftspeople that we've produced them, we can include their stories and their narratives in displaying these pieces of furniture too, and we can have a very ethical line from the purchase of that furniture to the museum, and that can be open and transparent.
And I'll just add that something that I'm a strong believer in is that museums, in the way that they display pieces of furniture, are contributing to their commodification. So museums display furniture for us to look at as if they're fine art pieces, rather than as if they're pieces of furniture to be used. And part of the story of Chandigarh's furniture that we really want to accentuate and dive into and explore is the use of the furniture and how it was used in Chandigarh for most of its lifetime. So I think one part of museums displaying this in a way that's more ethical and that helps break this cycles is, my dream is to allow people to sit in the furniture and allow people to use it and then allow it to exist as pieces of design rather than pieces of art. And sort of just a side note to this, the relationship between museums and the dealers, that the Design Museum in Switzerland actually bought their Chandigarh chair directly from Eric Tuchelom very early on in this process. So that sort of highlights the circle and how the presence in museums allows Tuchelom to then say, oh, but of course it's authentic. I sold one to the Design Museum in Switzerland and they're the home of Jeanneret, so they know what they're doing, so I must be right, et cetera, et cetera.
There was a shorter question which has disappeared now, but I'll quickly answer it because I liked it. What types of wood have gone into the making of Chandigarh furniture? Mainly teak and rosewood, and we believe Dalbregia, Siso, and Tectona grandis, which are sort of native to the local area.
So there's a question about from Pratyusha about have we tried approaching Indian architects who've worked in the project with Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret for their accounts. So there is a couple of architects still with us. We felt that at the moment with coronavirus, we wanted to kind of limit the sort of pressure we were putting on people, but we have spoken instead at the moment to a lot of architects and people working in Chandigarh on things like there is a kind of preservation heritage project looking at some of the buildings, and so we're quite interested in how they are considering the Chandigarh furniture as well. But I would also add, I mean, as you can see from that image at the beginning of the presentation, when we talk about the team, and we've maybe insinuated a little bit in this talk that there's kind of these key figures, but you can see from that image that the team means a huge number of people and all of the model makers and the craftspeople that were involved. And presumably many of them are still with us too. So, you know, I'd add a plug for anybody that might know people that you might be willing to introduce us to, that might be interested in talking about this. We'd really like to chat to them.
So there are also a few questions about preparatory drawings and planning drawings and what they might or might not suggest. And I know, Nia, we originally had a section about this and we took it out for time. So maybe you want to quickly give an overview of what we know.
So, you know, as we've mentioned, there's lots of sort of architectural design drawings used in the Indian Adventure, which is a big place that we've had access to them. There's also a couple of things digitized by CCA, but I think that they're not really housed in their archive. We're still unsure where those drawings exist. They may be in the Le Corbusier archive. This is part of why we want things digitized and made public. But I think the big thing to point out, and this has been pointed out by other researchers too, is that there is lots of drawings available of the chairs, most of which, I think almost all from what we've heard, are unsigned. And many of which are in English as well. And we know that Pierre Jeanneret didn't really speak much English. He did try to learn a little bit of Hindi. So these are clearly, and they're also clearly in another person's hand. We have other drawings in Pierre Jeanneret's hand, and these are clearly not in his own hand. So the drawings are really interesting because they, I mean, of course, it's a very complex process in a team, and that needs to be acknowledged too. But there is certainly somebody else's hand coming in at the process of making working drawings. And that's, I think, for us, quite key in thinking about sort of ownership and authorship around these pieces. I think
I can quickly add to that we dropped this phrase extractive capitalism into this presentation. And it applies to the chairs, but it also applies to the archives, because when Jeanneret left India at the end of his life, he brought all of his material with him, including a lot of things that now we would consider should belong in a government archive. So those things went with him back to Switzerland, and then eventually, because he had no children, went through his family and ended up at the Canadian Architectural Archives. So when we're talking about, you know, extraction and removal of these pieces from India, it's not just the removal of the pieces, it's also removal of archival information that allows us to build a fuller history.
So there's another slightly longer question that I think might be good to sort of read out, because it's got some interesting information in it too. This is from Nidhi Joshi. A lot of old campuses, government and private, more than 20 years ago, now have furniture which is derived from the Chandigarh chair, but they're slowly being replaced with pieces which are easier, cheaper to repair and replace. This means that campuses have graveyards of old furniture piled in basements. Many students pick them up and repurpose them or repair them for their new houses when they move out of campus. It would be interesting to see the journeys of these pieces as they exist in their homes. I think we would absolutely agree with that last point. I think it's, yeah, and I think we're all smiling also because we feel that if, as the narrative tells us, that this furniture was intended to be used and repurposed and eventually used as firewood, but certainly be kind of used and used and used until it wore out, that seems to be a kind of very apt trajectory for the furniture as well. So yes, again, if anybody has any documentation of this, it would be great to kind of give that a platform, I think.
And I just add to that, that also continues to counter the dealers' narratives that the furniture is unvalued, because clearly, if people are still using it and using elements of it and repurposing it, there still is value in it, and people are still sort of caring for it, repairing for it, and modifying it for their current use, which is definitely a form of value.
And then I think we have a few questions in the same line, but I'll read one out, which is, what should ideally happen to all the old furniture which many people are trying to discard, and what needs to be done with these pieces? And I think we all have slightly different views about that, so it might be nice to do a round robin here.
So I can start us off. So the Chandigarh Urban Lab that we mentioned earlier, that's headed up by Vikram and Victia Prakash, and a lot of the students, I think, have participated in. From my perspective, they've done some really interesting work around this exact question. If we're critiquing the removal of these chairs, but there's still tons of it and it's not usable anymore, what can we do with it? And they've come up with some different ideas around creating street furniture, also thinking about how the design can be used in these different places. So I think that there is, from my perspective, I'm also a designer, but I think there's some interesting sort of interventions that can be made into this furniture. I mean, of course, it means that there has to be an openness to that, which is challenged if you think that they are extremely high valuable commodities. But I think that's a more appropriate way to think about this old broken furniture.
And I think I can add that several of us, all of us, I in particular, sort of feel like we're not necessarily the right people to decide what should happen with it within India. That we're not from Chandigarh, we're not from India. We're learning about this furniture and we want to collaborate as much as possible with other people who know about it. But that this particular area may not be one in which we can or should give a great decisive answer. But we do feel like we can give some decisive answers about what should happen to the pieces that have already been extracted, and sort of our continuing uncomfortability with where they've landed and how they're being used in the United States and in Western Europe. And we'd like to perhaps not see them, or I would like to perhaps not see them where they are, because I don't feel like they've gotten there under moral and just ways.
Sorry, I realize you're waiting for me to say something. Yeah, I mean, I kind of just have to agree with everything that's been said. I think what Nia said about the repurposing of the furniture in the ways that one of the commentators had mentioned of what's currently happening with the students is a really good example of how to deal with the sort of mounting piles. And there must be uses that the city of Chandigarh requires that can make use of the amount of wood or the materials that are stored in that way. And again, I sort of, yeah, agree with what Petra's saying about the idea that I think what we're uncomfortable with here is seeing them, for example, in Kim Kardashian's home, where, you know, they have been completely restored and clearly a lot of time and effort spent into making them look like extremely expensive, brand new pieces of furniture that have very much been extracted from India in a way that we don't deem to be ethical. And I think that's where our problem lies, is with that rather than anywhere else.
There's a couple of questions here from Ishita. She's mentioned a couple of the architects in Chandigarh that we could meet: Kiran Joshi, Sangeeta Bagga, Sarbjeet Bagga, who've been working actively in areas of conservation and preservation of the modernist architecture and design history. And I think that's a very fair shout out to them. Sangeeta has been really helpful as well for us. There is there's, as we said at the beginning, there's a really interesting and quite a wide body of work around Chandigarh and its architecture, and now increasingly its furniture too. And I guess the only thing I would add is just from our perspective, what we felt kind of coming to this furniture as design historians is that something could be added to these narratives by taking a specific design history approach rather than, say, an architectural approach. And for me, that's important because the architecture cannot be removed. I'm sure they would try if they could. I mean, they've removed the shutters, but the larger architecture can't be removed from Chandigarh, but the furniture can. And so I think it has I think it raises different questions for things like conservation, things for preservation, things for writing about the furniture. So from my perspective, that's quite important. And the second question was, does our research intend to investigate the role of the lack of bureaucratic process in Chandigarh, which might have caused the neglect of these otherwise historically important design assets? So I'll hand that over.
So first, I want to show appreciation for the phrasing of this question, because I think as we've been talking about this, and it's a very controversial topic, and it's something that we don't always feel qualified to speak on, but that's something we keep coming back to, is democratic processes, and whether decisions that are made, and the fact that we might not have the space or the qualifications to comment on decisions that were not made, but we can generally say that we think the heritage and the history and the objects that belong to us as people living in any individual places, decisions about them need to be made by us, and they need to be democratic. So that's a very long way of absolutely not answering that question, but that's sort of what it comes back to for us, that what we're interested in and what we're thinking about when we think about these questions about what the government in Chandigarh did or did not do and why it did or did not do it is less to do with specific actions and more about democratic processes and ensuring, as we've mentioned earlier, that these pieces of design can be used and appreciated by a lot of different people, and that the decisions about them are made by a lot of different people. And we also have a question about whether Charlotte Perriand was involved in the Chandigarh project, which I can say, no, she was not. And I apologize for talking so much about her. We've only recently come across this sort of project to create her as a designer too, which we think Tushalom may have been involved in. So I'm a little bit giddy to throw mentions of that in.
And there's another question here of what we think the ideal process of raising awareness about the furniture and also making its history and design more accessible would be. I think, so I guess beginning with that question would be what we've outlined in trying to gather as much information as possible, which clearly exists in either anecdotal form or sort of haptic knowledge that can be passed down either orally or from kind of personal archives of photographs, etc., and gathering them and attempting to sort of publish them on a sort of fully available platform. We don't know exactly what that would be yet, but for example, what we're doing with the auction records, as we mentioned, is trying to publish them online in a way that they're easy to look through and sort of easy to access and open for everyone. We're hoping also eventually to do that with any sort of material that we write and any of the talks that we present, but how we would go about doing that with sort of future oral material, perhaps, at this point, we're not entirely sure.
So we're just going to take one more question and then kind of close up tonight. Does anybody have, Petra and Gregor, if there's anything that you'd like to go for? Otherwise, I will pull out the question. Okay, so Shweta asks, would you say the Chandigarh chair designs have become almost democratic in a way with so many manufacturers and designers involved in taking so many forms, especially since it was ubiquitous at the time, something that has been erased by the auction houses?
So I can take a first stab at this. We've hinted a little bit at this in the question and answer, but we're sort of seeing and exploring this as a diversion between the treatment of design and the treatment of fine art objects, and that fine art objects are mostly by definition unique and singular, and they're valued for that. And what we've seen in the transformation and the narrative of Chandigarh chairs that's developed is this movement from functional pieces of design to individual elements of art, which have to be venerated as unique and special in and of their own existence in order to have value. So I think we had a question earlier, brief question about how many of these were made and how many were lost. And part of our answer to that is the same as this, that we don't know, because the narrative that's been constructed would be foolish to mention that there were thousands of these made, because then it would be harder to sell them for a lot of money because they would be less special, which always takes us back to the same thought that while we believe Kim Kardashian probably likes and wanted a chair designed by Le Corbusier's cousin, she probably doesn't want a chair that was used by a Punjabi administrator for 35 years. And so the movement of these into art and high design is very important.
And I think I would just add to that idea of kind of the use of these furnitures and how that fits into the narrative, is that whilst we kind of stand by this idea that they're kind of being Europeanized, there is also a kind of weird fetishization of especially the original objects and any what's often called markings, but is actually a kind of fairly standard government coding system that many people will have seen on government furniture, which locates the furniture within a building and within a sort of quantity of furniture within that building, so it's kind of traceable. And of markings, as they get called, are highlighted in the story of these kind of auction records. They're kind of pointed out as sort of unique parts of this furniture. So that part of them being Indian objects is, as I say, sort of fetishized and highlighted, but actually objects which were used by people, which are still used by people, is kind of made invisible or not highlighted, not spoken about. And so I think that's kind of not something that we've gone into in a great deal of detail in this talk, but is another kind of important aspect of how these objects get made into, as Petra said, this kind of sort of lesser numbers, high design commodities. And so I think, yes, go ahead, Petra, sorry.
Just gonna add on that topic, we just got a last minute, what I think is an incredibly great question, asking at the end, how might we create a spirit of appreciation for these objects in their native state? And this is my favorite thing to talk about, so I apologize, but I think we use them. We use this furniture and we use it as it's intended, as chairs and library tables and stools, and that shows an amazing appreciation for things that were created to be functional objects. And we've tossed around a phrase that my grandmother used about clothing: wear it well and wear it out. And that shows a great deal of love and appreciation for the objects that we have and how they've been made.
So I think that feels to me like a really nice way to end the talk. I'm sorry that we haven't got through all of the questions, but we did put up our brand new email address that we hope some of you might drop us a line on, which is chandigarchairs@gmail.com. So we could kind of have those conversations there. We'd be really happy to can continue this conversation. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nia, Petra, and Gregor. It was absolutely fascinating. I had no clue that, so much provenance building and, all the fascinating details that went into making the chair an Instagram sensation. And for those of you who were looking out for the Kardashian sisters, somebody asked me whether they were, she was doing the presentation. So, well, sorry about that, but absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.